Welcome back, everyone. Today, I want to talk about a study mistake so common that almost every student makes it. I certainly did years ago. We often sit for hours with one subject trying to squeeze a massive amount of information into a single intense session, usually right before a big exam. In that moment, it feels productive because you are rereading the same material and it starts to feel familiar. But a few days later, it's gone. In science, we call this massed practice, or more commonly, cramming. Today, I'm going to show you why this approach fails your brain and how a century of research has revealed a much more powerful way to make information stick for years, not just hours. Over more than a century of memory research, scientists discovered a powerful learning principle called distributed practice, more commonly known as spacing or spaced learning. Back in the late 1800s, scientists began noticing a very interesting pattern. When learning is spread out over time, people remember information much better compared to when the exact same amount of study is squeezed into one long session. More recently, researcher Nicholas Cepeda and his team analyzed more than 300 experiments on this exact topic, and the conclusion was remarkably consistent. Studying the same material on two or more separate occasions is usually far more effective than doing it all at once. And this wasn't just seen in one specific type of learning, the effect appeared across many different situations. Memorizing vocabulary, recalling paragraphs, learning facts, and even certain motor skills and performance tasks. And importantly, the improvement was often large, not just a tiny difference. So, what does this actually mean in real life? Imagine you have 5 total hours to study for an exam. Your brain will usually retain much more if you study 1 hour a day for 5 days instead of one exhausting 5-hour cramming session the night before. And what's fascinating is that in many studies, the total study time was the same. The difference was simply when the studying happened. That means the brain does not just care about how long you study, it also cares deeply about how the learning is spaced over time. Another example comes from a study by Bloom and Schul in the 1980s. They studied high school students learning French vocabulary under either massed practice or distributed practice conditions. One group completed all the studying in a single 30-minute session, while the other spread the same total study time across 3 separate 10-minute sessions over 3 days. Interestingly, both groups performed similarly immediately after learning. But when tested again 4 days later, the distributed practice group performed substantially better by around 35%. But here's a moment from the research. It's not just about spacing your learning, it's about how much you space it. Nicholas Cepeda and his team described this as a kind of temporal ridgeline of optimal learning, basically a sweet spot for the timing of your revision sessions. The ideal gap between study sessions actually depend on how far away your final test is. In other words, how long you want the information to stay in your memory. The relationship is what scientists called non-monotonic, meaning as the gap between study sessions increases, memory performance first improves, but only up to a certain point. After that, if the gap becomes too large, performance starts dropping again because more forgetting happens between sessions. So, there is actually a kind of Goldilocks zone for studying. Not too short, not too long, but just right for your goal. And importantly, that just right gap changes depending on how far away your final test is, or in other words, how long you want the information to stay in your memory. In this study, researchers found that if you want to remember something for 7 days, the optimal gap between study sessions was roughly 1 day. If you want to remember it for 35 days, the optimal gap became closer to 11 days. And if you wanted the information to stay in your memory for 70 to 350 days, the optimal gap increased to around 21 days. In other words, the longer you want to remember something, the longer the optimal spacing between your revision sessions tends to become. Furthermore, another important question also emerges. If spaced learning works, then how many repetitions are actually ideal? To study this, Price and colleagues followed more than 26,000 practicing physicians over almost 30 months. Some physicians received no spaced repetition, some received one repetition, and others received two repetitions over time. And the results were remarkably clear. Spaced repetition improved long term learning and retention compared to no repetition. But even more interestingly, two spaced repetitions worked better than just one. And the researchers also tested something very important, not just whether people remembered the exact same information, but whether they could apply that knowledge in a different situation. To test this, they presented rewritten clinical scenarios that tested the same underlying concepts in a new context. And even there, spaced repetition still improved performance. Because in real life, true learning is not just about repeating information mechanically, it's being able to transfer and apply what you know in new situations. Now, if spaced learning works so well, then why do so many of us still prefer cramming? And the answer is that cramming often creates an illusion of learning. When you reread the same information again and again in one sitting, it starts feeling familiar, easy, and fluent in that moment. Your brain mistakes that familiarity for true learning. And in the short term, cramming can actually improve immediate recall, which is exactly why students often feel, I studied so well yesterday. But the problem is that memory is often sitting mostly in short term memory, not deeply consolidated into long term memory. Spacing feels harder because the brain has to work harder to retrieve the information again after some forgetting has happened. And interestingly, more recent neuroscience studies suggest that this extra retrieval effort may actually help strengthen the neural patterns involved in long term memory formation. The brain is forced to reactivate the memory again more effortfully, and that process may help strengthen the memory more deeply over time. So, effective learning does not always feel effective in the moment, and ineffective learning can sometimes feel deceptively productive. And interestingly, researchers think that spaced learning may work because the brain may literally need time between learning sessions for certain biological processes involved in memory formation to properly unfold. Modern neuroscience studies suggest that learning is not a single instant event. After we study something, the brain continues processing that information in the background through a process called memory consolidation. And during this time, several things may be happening. For example, synaptic connections between neurons, the communication links through which brain cells send signals to each other, may begin strengthening over time, making the information easier for the brain to access later again. Also, certain memory related proteins and signaling pathways may become activated, almost like the brain is switching on internal repair and reinforcement systems that help convert a fragile short term memory into a more stable long term one. And the brain may gradually stabilize the memory trace over time, making the information less fragile and more resistant to being forgotten. Some of these biological processes unfold over minutes, some over hours, and some may continue even longer. Which means that if learning sessions are crammed too closely together, the brain may not get enough time to fully reinforce and stabilize the earlier memory before new information is added again. And this may be one of the reasons why spaced learning often produces stronger and more durable memories over time compared to cramming. So now we know all this, but we need to remember that the brain may not actually require some perfectly engineered revision schedule. Researchers found that increasing the overall spacing between retrieval sessions strongly improved long term retention. But the exact pattern of spacing, whether the intervals gradually expanded, stayed equal, or even contracted, often mattered much less. In other words, you do not need a mathematically perfect revision calendar. What matters most is revisiting the information repeatedly over time instead of cramming it all into one sitting. If you enjoyed this kind of science based learning content, feel free to subscribe and I'll see you in the next one.